Before we get started, here is what is made available to you by the fact that this video is on YouTube.
It's a high-tech prosthesis.
First, if things move too slow or too fast, you can pause, go back, or adjust the video speed. Some students watch at 0.75 times speed, which would be absolute torture for plenty of other students, including myself. I tend to engage with YouTube at double speed. And the general guidance for those looking to get the most out of this video would likely be copied over from reading best practices, namely, watch first at a fast pace, building your understanding for the framework and the overall design and ideas, and then go back and more deliberately or carefully attend to the details the second time, looking for apparent contradictions, which tend to be misunderstandings, and seeing where the analogies are incomplete or what was not said, perhaps on purpose. In addition to speed control, YouTube auto-generates very good subtitles, which occasionally make for good comedy, but I would say are more than 95% accurate. It also makes transcripts for you, which you can copy and paste and pretend that you made your own notes. The comments section also tends to be a better place than the course's learning management software to comment on or start discussions about lecture content, because you can comment as you watch and leave timestamps so people know what you're referring to. One of my favorite features of YouTube is the kind people who comment helpful timestamps for the benefit of other watchers or for the benefit of me, so I know what their comment is actually referring to. Over here is where you can make me feel good about spending time making watchable videos rather than teaching my kids things. Unreinforced behavior becomes extinct, and when we don't participate in the social sphere, the most pathological voices take over. Common sense is not dead, it's just quiet, so maybe murmur a bit. If you don't have a YouTube account, please take the 180 seconds required to make one, if only so that you can participate in this minimal way.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Welcome. First off, what do we mean by abnormal? Is it just not normal? Let's say a friend or family member hears that you are taking an abnormal psychology course, so they say, well, you must be the expert now. My cousin, Wes, is afraid of elevators. Is that normal? What we can do is figure out what questions we would need to ask before we could adequately answer this question. It would be helpful to know some things about Wes, some things about how afraid of elevators he is, and what he does in response to that fear, or as a result of that fear. But that's sort of just the tip of the iceberg, trying to figure out what the question means. Let's say we define all our terms. There's still a whole bunch of really good questions we need to ask to contextualize this case before we find out whether Wes's fear is normal or not. First off, what's Wes's history with elevators? Was he trapped in one or assaulted in one? What does the fear look like, both in terms of Wes's experience and in terms of what other people can see and infer about Wes's experience of fear of elevators? How often, or based on what cues, does Wes get afraid of elevators? If I mention the word elevator, does this prompt Wes to be afraid, or does he actually need to be in an elevator to experience fear? Also, how consistent is Wes's fear of elevators? Is he only afraid sometimes? Or is it, quote, nearly always, as a diagnosis of specific phobia would require? This will be our first topic for today's lecture. What is abnormal? Then I'll work to motivate the course a little bit, and then get into some history. The current conception of mental illness is trouble adapting to your environment. If you have an adaptive failure of some kind, we'll start to look at whether it's a specific type of mental disorder and whether it's enough of a failure to call it psychopathological, or to say that you are a victim of psychopathology. But this isn't nearly enough. This idea of adaptational failure isn't nearly enough to capture what we're talking about when we're talking about mental illness. So a few concepts tend to come up. You don't need all of these concepts for every disorder, but this is generally how we tend to think about mental illness. We think in terms of suffering. Is the individual with the disorder, or who we are considering for diagnosis of a disorder, suffering, or could they be causing suffering in other individuals due to psychopathology? Are the behaviors that the individual is engaging in a concern to the community? Is what they are doing met with disapproval or concern? Is the individual's way of being in the world uncommon? The pithy idea here is that, well, if we all have the disorder, then it's not much of a disorder anymore. Next, dysfunction. For a diagnosis, for nearly any diagnosis, you need some form of dysfunction. That is, do you have trouble at work? Do you have trouble with your social relationships? Or, also here, do you have trouble with your health? Finally, surprise. This has to do with an individual being surprised at their own symptoms. So everybody has their own baseline for what's normal for them. Has something changed in your biology or in your circumstances that now leads you to feel that you are experiencing some sort of psychopathology. So a disorder that you can clearly see involves suffering would be depression, subjective suffering. Disorder that clearly involves disapproval of society might be all kinds of paraphilias, such as pedophilia. Something that involves infrequency, that's nearly all of the mental disorders, but for the purpose of thought, you could imagine dementia. If everyone got Alzheimer's dementia at around age 65, then it wouldn't be a disorder. We would just call it aging, right? But not everybody gets Alzheimer's. Not everybody experiences that level of dementia as they age. Therefore, because it's infrequent, it is a disorder. A good example for dysfunction might be intellectual disability. What we care about with intellectual disability is how well the individual can function on their own, accomplish what they need to, get their groceries, pay rent checks, satisfy the basic demands of living. That's generally what we're looking for when we're assessing the severity of intellectual disability. The problem isn't that the individual is different. The problem is that the individual is going to have trouble functioning in society as the rest of us have created it. Finally, a good example for the surprise category would be adjustment disorder. So adjustment disorder is in the post-traumatic and other disorders category in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it has to do with individuals experiencing something like a breakup, a change of employment. They respond with big emotional changes and maybe the inability to function effectively. It's been used as a defense in trials when people snapped and they said, oh, it was the pressure of all these things happening in my life at once. I wasn't in my right mind. I was in the throes of an adjustment disorder. The three of these concepts that seem most important to us and to the current zeitgeist are suffering, so the suffering of the individual, dysfunction, it's very difficult to get a diagnosis without some sort of dysfunction, and norms. I don't think a lot of people would respect a psychology or a psychiatry that doesn't look on something like pedophilia as a pathology. So when a given problem appears to be hurting the client, the person with the problem, or the people around the client, that's when we see adaptational failure. These are the criteria that make mental illness most apparent. So please keep in mind that we're not driving around in unmarked vans looking for people that are different and then jumping out and then stamping their forehead with some sort of scarlet letter and saying you're different and labeling people. We're generally looking for individuals who are distressed, who need help, and that, importantly, we can provide help for. I'm going to give you a diagnosis if the diagnosis can't help you in some way. Long gone are the days of the 1850s where doctors were diagnosing slaves who had multiple escape attempts with drapetomania and then suggesting that treatment for this mental illness would be cutting off their toes so they can run away. Also, not quite as long gone, but are the days of the 1950s up until 1973, where we were calling individuals with homosexuality sexual psychopaths and saying they had sociopathic personality disturbances because of their sexual preference. So who are getting diagnoses? Depressed people who need some sort of relief. They need some sort of acknowledgement for their hidden disability. And in forensic contexts, citizens who, either because they are young and helpless or because they pay their taxes, ought to be kept safe from those individuals who act on urges that we do not approve of. Today, all diagnoses begin with people who need help. The runaway slave in the 1850s certainly did not need the type of help that the doctors were giving him, and I highly doubt that any gay person before 1973 was being helped by the diagnosis of sexual psychopathy. We try to make sure that individuals need help and that the label would actually provide some sort of help. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. This is a frequency distribution. The x-axis has whatever we're measuring. It could be height, hours of sleep you get every night. It's a symmetrical bell curve. The middle is the mean, median, and the mode, and tapering off from the middle are the more extreme values. If this was the height of Canadian males, the middle would be 5'10", right about here, and here would be 5'7", and 6'1", because one standard deviation of male height in Canada is 3 inches. Somewhere around here would be 5'4", and somewhere up here would be 6'4". So if you're 6'4" or taller, you're taller than 97% of the population of Canadian males. And if you're 5'4" or shorter, you are only taller than between 2 and 3% of the male Canadian population. This is called a frequency distribution because on the y-axis is the frequency or number of cases, often the proportion of cases. People mostly cluster around the middle. You're not equally likely to be 6'7" as you are to be 5'10". So roughly speaking, what is statistically and experientially abnormal is that which is rare or infrequent. in either direction. This is both a simple illustration of what is meant by normal. Note that it's not a value judgment, it's just what we can expect from our surroundings. Basically, everything you expect of other people is going to follow a bell curve. You're going to expect people that you talk to in person to speak at a certain volume. Most people are going to hit that volume very closely because they know not to speak too loudly, not to speak abnormally loudly, and not to speak too quietly. From their experience talking with other people and from their emotional intelligence in maybe reading how you respond to them, they will calibrate their voice to the right volume. So this represents normal as we tend to use it as a concept. As a human walking around the world, our nervous system starts to develop expectations about stimuli around us and reacts with surprise or orientation towards that which violates the expectations, the learning that we've built up through our experience. So this could be seen as a definition. Abnormal is what you're not used to, or that which is unexpected. It's also a model of how the concept works in your head. If I ask you whether my cousin Wes's fear of elevators is normal, you're going to have your own set of experiences with people, a big part of which will be your own personal experiences with and emotional reactions to elevators, and you're going to judge the normality of Wes based in large part on that when you're trying to come to a conclusion about Wes. Now that we have the concept visualized, we can see some obvious problems with normality, namely the fact that the frequency distribution is always going to have tails. If something starts stymieing our biodiversity and the variation in human height gets reduced, so maybe we stop having babies that grow to be 6'5" and taller, and we stop having babies that grow to be 5'4" and shorter, such that 6'3" is suddenly the tallest and 5'6" is about as short as Canadian males get. In other words, something changed human biology and it shrunk the two tails, both sides of the tails. Now everybody's normal, right? Well, no, your perceptual system just shrinks its idea of normal, and now 6'3" and 5'6" people are the abnormal ones. Your perceptual system cares about expectable cases in the same way that a clothing manufacturer might. The middle of the bell curve being medium, to the left of medium being small, and to the right of medium being large. We're gonna make the most of those three sizes, says the clothing manufacturer, and less of the more extreme and rare sizes. Put into a more problematic context, we're gonna make desks so that they seat very comfortably the average Canadian human. Average for females is 5'4", average for males is 5'10", so we'll go right in the middle, we'll make everybody uncomfortable except the people who happen to just beyond the midpoint of 5'7". We'll make the desks most comfortable for those individuals 5'7", but we'll build in as much tolerance as you can, so maybe you can still touch the ground if you're 5'3", and you can still fit into the seat if you're 6'2". But anything more than that, if you're shorter than 5'3", well then circulation's gonna get cut off on your legs because you can't touch the ground. And if you're 6'3" or taller, maybe you're gonna be squished in and hunched over. The people who make the desks have to deal with the fact that they have to choose a size and do their best to accommodate our diverse human variation. We likely wouldn't expect office chairs or public seating to be so perfect and adjustable that either Shaquille O'Neal or Peter Dinklage could sit comfortably in it. That would be great, but we recognize it's nearly impossible. It's a big design challenge. But of course, all of this is just an analogy or a metaphor for what your brain has to do, and what society has to do as well. But let's not get to Plato's Republic and conflate the two. You have to generate expectations about people and hope that they conduct themselves according to those expectations. You have to comport yourself according to the expectations of other people, at least within reason, in order for transactions, cooperation, and society to exist. Sometimes these expectations feel like rules, and sometimes they are rules, but this is the interaction between the individual human brain and the expectations of society. Our human brains pick up on expectable patterns, the range of behavior, how much and how often people tend to break expectations, and those human brains that pick up on those patterns make stuff like desks and laws and commercials and policies and entertainment and architecture, which all works in part because we continue to meet the expectations, the normative expectations of the people who made these laws, these buildings, these school curricula, and everything else that exists for you, in part because the humans who made it knew that it would probably fit you or be appropriate for you. Okay, but what about those outside of the expected range? What about those of us who can't sit still through an 8-hour school day? Those of us who feel a profound sadness without having a reason to? Those of us who are scared of something that can't actually affect us? Those of us who can't be brought to care about other people? Those of us who don't understand that when someone else changes their tone of voice, it means that what they say should be interpreted in the opposite manner? Those of us who can't understand the contracts we need to sign in order to get what we want. Those of us picked up by police for not conforming to a rule that we don't understand. Those of us who have to check the door lock 12 times before we go out someplace to make sure it's locked. Or those of us who hear voices and commands that nobody else can hear. Well, that is what we're here to discuss. The first myth to dispel is that somebody can be all abnormal or that somebody can be all normal. There are tons of traits and nobody is normal on all of them. We all have abnormal things about us. The big question, in terms of whether we are adapted to our environment, is, are any of the traits on which we are abnormal traits that seem important to those around us or to the environment that those around us have built or cultivated? We all fall somewhere on the intelligence bell curve, somewhere on the systolic blood pressure bell curve, somewhere on the suggestibility bell curve, happiness, personality, variables like extroversion, how reactive we tend to be to environmental changes. And on all of these traits, there are two sources or measures of expectation and variation. There is how much you tend to vary day by day, year by year on whatever trait this happens to be. Let's call it blood pressure, and you tend to vary from ideal to pre-hypertensive. That's you. That's an expectation for you. Here's your bell curve. Next, an example of someone who's not you. Dave has a bit more variation than you do. His bell curve looks a little more like this. And then there's Jane, steady Jane. She doesn't vary much, so her spread looks like this. In terms of midpoints, you, Dave, and Jane have pretty similar midpoints. You have very different stories in terms of the spread, the expectable spread of your scores. On any given day, I would expect Dave to have lower blood pressure than Jane, but on some days it's within expectations for Dave to be higher than Jane. Most of the most interesting questions in psychology have to do with spread and variation, not between groups, but within an individual. Some general statements to start off with. We are all mostly on the middle in most traits, but we are all in the tails. We are all abnormal on some traits. Maybe we cry more than the average person when we watch sentimental movies. Maybe we get annoyed at other people quicker than average. Everything that you could care to notice about someone has some sort of bell curve or normal concept behind it in your neural architecture, and that expectation may be enshrined in the dictates of society as well. The question is not whether you are abnormal, the question is how you are abnormal, and are you abnormal in one of the ways that society expects or requires you to be normal on. A thought experiment here is think of a trait, behavior, or preference that you believe you are abnormal in. What is something, some category of thing that sets you apart? I'll go first. I have an overactive sense of humor. I find humor in everything, especially things I'm not supposed to find funny, and I'm easily irritated and distracted by noise. The thought experiment here would be, once you land on something, then imagine a world in which society decided it needed you not to be abnormal on that trait. Individuals from the boomer and greatest generation may, for example, if they were left-handed, have been forced to use their right hand for things, like my grandparents and my wife's mother. They were left-handed, but were forced by their teachers in school to use their right hand. This was seen by those teachers as quite important. This is what society demands of you, child, that you be like this. Sometimes, like in the case of left-handedness, what society demands of us is rather arbitrary. But of course, sometimes, as in the case of following the law, not touching others that don't want you to touch them, or meeting occupational expectations, in those cases, society demanding conformity or adaptation seem quite reasonable and perhaps our only option if we want to get anything done. As you've likely probably already heard elsewhere, there is no average person. Averages are statistical abstractions, and I'll just go ahead and say, with our nearly infinite number of traits, that nobody is in the middle on all of them. You deviate from the grand norm on many things, and you sometimes deviate from your norm in things as well. Maybe you have an abnormally low mood when your average mood is usually quite chipper. You're still within expectations for the average person, but you're outside of expectations for you. You are within normal population variance, but outside of your normal variance. Your mood would have to get much lower in order to be abnormally low by population standards. So you can be abnormal for society, and you can also be, on occasion, abnormal for your own expectations, your own normal as well. And either one of these types of abnormality could pose an adaptation problem for you. If you have an abnormally low mood for population standards, then society, which expects you to do your job, greet others politely, and motivate yourself to accomplish tasks, well then your low mood could prevent you from meeting those challenges. You're outside of the range that society is built for. Abnormal psychology would argue that it's when we encounter these sorts of adaptational problems that some extra help, maybe in the form of an intervention, maybe in the form of a label that can help us understand what's happening to us, might be needed or helpful. There are a few places where our societal expectations for what is normal are made rather explicit. In legal context, we have the expectation of what a reasonable person would do in terms of standard of care, due diligence, prior restraint, etc. Expectations regarding what the average person should understand, be able to do or read or learn or follow. We have expectations regarding when young humans unlock certain abilities, and expectations regarding what's comfortable for people and what constitutes good psychological adjustment to your environment. Are you meeting in a way that's healthy for you the demands of your context? If not, what help and or changes in expectation should be forthcoming. In the legal context, the idea of the normal person is probably most clearly and explicitly used. When seeking to convict someone of a crime, it must be established that their body committed the crime, beyond a reasonable doubt, but also that they were of evil mind at the time of the crime. Put another way, true crimes require moral blameworthiness. The mens rea component of a trial is establishing that a blameworthy decision was made. In other words, a normal person with a normal moral compass would not have made the decision that the accused made, or at least beyond a reasonable doubt made. Therefore, the individual is guilty, not just of physically committing a crime, but of mentally making the wrong choice. The place where the requirement for mens rea is likely most clearly enshrined in our Canadian Criminal Code is in Section 13, which states that no one under 12 can be criminally responsible for any committed or omitted action. If a 10-year-old intentionally grabs her father's rifle and intentionally shoots him multiple times with that rifle, she is not, in the eyes of the law, morally blameworthy, because the law has decided, in black and white, that at age of 10, she can't understand what she's doing. She can't understand the consequences well enough to be considered morally blameworthy for her action. You can, of course, argue in court that the 10-year-old should be seen as morally blameworthy. The point is just that enshrined in black and white is the fact that the court is probably not going to find her morally blameworthy. The court would have to first decide that the girl was abnormally, for a 10-year-old, aware of the consequences of her actions, and then that with that awareness, she made an abnormally immoral decision in shooting her father. Without imagined normality and expectations of how responsible adults would behave, there is not much left of the law. It requires the imaginary normal person, which brings to mind great critical questions like, what is the expected intelligence level of the normal human that the law imagines? Is the normal person more male, more female? And what moral or ethical values are we presuming, or may we presume, that this normal person holds? Now, this standard of the normal expectable person can be applied in different ways. The one that requires the most mind reading is called subjective mens rea. When we actually have good evidence regarding the intentions of the individual, then we've established subjective mens rea. If right before committing a crime, you texted a bunch of people or posted on a message board that you were going to do it and that you wanted to do it and that you're doing it on purpose, and maybe afterwards you post about how great it was, we have subjective mens rea on you. As long as we can establish there's no reason to think that you were framed, then we can infer that you did in fact have evil intention. The question before the court is, if we establish that you intended the consequences of your actions, or that you at some point could have realized or probably realized the consequences of your actions, but you proceeded anyway, or maybe that you were willfully blind, where willful blindness is not wanting to think about or consider the consequences of your action. Remaining ignorant of the consequences of your behavior, but deliberately so, not inquiring when a normal person would have inquired as to what consequences their behavior might have. One place where willful blindness might come up is in criminal harassment. Do you constantly mock or make sarcastic or serious sexual comments about one of your coworkers? Where this happens, it's often the case that the perpetrator will justify it as humorous or good-natured. So in that case, it doesn't seem like they intended harm, but if they in fact contributed to a toxic environment, it could be argued that the individual is responsible, not because they intended to harm the individual, but because they were willfully blind as to the need to inquire as to whether the individual was being harmed. In other words, a reasonable person would have stopped and asked, are you okay with me or us poking fun at you? Is it still all fun and games? Or do you need us to stop with these jokes? Or put downs or sexual comments? If the court can infer that a reasonable person would have inquired, then a lack of inquiry shows a failure to live up to the standards of a normal, reasonable person, and therefore shows moral blameworthiness for any harm caused by this alleged criminal harassment. I dilated on willful blindness in part because subjective mens rea presents us with a problem that willful blindness makes a bit obvious, and that problem is mind reading. How do you know that the person who's doing the harassing was willfully ignorant versus just ignorant? From what do you derive knowledge of their will? The version of mens rea that does not involve this level of mind reading is called objective mens rea. It doesn't ask what should we infer beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused willed or desired or intended. Rather, it asks only what would the reasonable expectations for this human have been in this situation. What standard of care could we have have expected them to follow? Roy was driving in the fog, and he went to turn from a gravel road onto a busier street. He was turning left, but through the fog came a large truck. It hit Roy in the passenger side and killed his friend, who was in the front passenger seat when Roy was driving. So he was in a terrible crash, and he lost his friend, and then he's up on charges for not driving carefully. And the initial determination was that Roy was guilty of not behaving according to the standard of care, guilty for the death of his friend. But one of the things established in his trial was the lack of visibility due to the fog. So on appeal, it was a rather simple question of what could be expected of a normal person in this situation. Humans can't see through fog, and parking randomly on the side of the road might not necessarily be a good idea. What would a reasonable person have done differently? So on appeal, it was decided that Roy wasn't guilty of the death of his friend. But note that the crux of the case here is, what would we expect from a normal person? Not an overly anxious person who would pull the car to the side of the road, but a normal person. Now, if you're wondering how an objective comparison to Roy with an imaginary normal person would establish that Roy had an evil mind at the time of the incident, an answer comes from Cromwell, namely that establishing objective mens rea brings with it the presumption of a subjective fault on the part of the individual. They were, after all, the ones driving their own body at the time. But of course, the neat distinction between subjective and objective mens rea is not always so neat in reality. Often cases will involve both objective and subjective components, such as the Alberta hatchet attack case. Friends were drinking, and one of them attacked the other with a hatchet. Her defense was, I was so drunk that I couldn't possibly have known what I was doing with that hatchet. And here's the judge focusing our attention on what's actually being decided in the case. I don't know about you, but in this quote, I read a lot of sarcasm. What's being decided is whether the evidence here, if believed, could reasonably support the inference that Point, the hatchet wielder, was too drunk to know that 15 forceful blows to the back of the victim's head with an axe or hatchet would likely cause serious bodily harm or death. Is there ever a situation where anyone could possibly be too drunk to know that 15 axe strikes to someone's head would harm them? The question of whether we're assessing subjective or objective mens rea here is rather moot. We're kind of establishing both. One of my favorite details about this case is the fact that we actually didn't end up needing to answer this question because she contradicted her own defense, specifically when she was being interviewed for her description of events. She prefaced her testimony by saying that she hadn't drank that much, and she was still quite able to recall what happened on that evening. Her defense was not successful. But wait a second, does that defense ever work? Can you ever say you were too drunk to be morally responsible for your actions? Well, yes, and this is one of the cases where we took a look at that and we decided, well, we actually don't like that loophole in the law, that you can be too drunk to be morally responsible. In this case of R.V. Davio, an older woman was the victim in this case. She was in a wheelchair. At the end of a date, she said, okay, I'm going to the other room to go to sleep. And he, who had just opened a bottle of alcohol, said, okay, I'm going to be in here drinking it. And at some point in the night, he entered her room and raped her. And his defense was, I drank the entire bottle of alcohol, I don't remember doing this, so I must have been too drunk to be in my right mind, i.e. too drunk to have a guilty mind. And the reason why this case led to a change in our criminal code is that by following precedent and adhering to the law as it's written, Davio was acquitted. It was established that he was too drunk to be responsible for raping a woman, causing reasonable people to say, we don't like that, let's change the code, let's change the criminal code. So they did. Section 33.1 now reads, it is not a defense by reason of self-induced intoxication to say you lacked intent or voluntariness to commit the offense. It can still be a factor that's taken into account, of course, but if you intentionally got yourself intoxicated, you are responsible for what you do in that intoxicated state. As a thinking example, you could take drunk driving. If we accepted the idea that you could be too drunk to be morally responsible for something, then if you're buzzed and you want to drive home, well, you should actually get a little bit more drunk before you start driving. That way, if you do get in an accident, you're not morally responsible for the accident. Yeah, that doesn't scan. We shouldn't allow that to happen, right? So the way the law works is you are morally responsible for getting yourself into the state of drunkenness. We acknowledge that you may not have intended to hit someone with your car when you were driving drunk, but you are morally responsible for getting yourself to the level of intoxication that led to you hitting someone with your car, so you're not off the hook. You're morally responsible. At the risk of giving you too many examples in a legal context, the Canadian courts recognize something called automatism. This is the idea that you may have, as a body, committed a crime, but that body may not have been driven by you. So think sleepwalking, or in terms of the etymology of the word automatism, really good hypnosis. The court divides up defenses of automatism. That is, if somebody says, I'm not morally responsible because it wasn't me driving my body, the court wants to know whether you are arguing for insane automatism or non-insane automatism. Now, the court views insanity in terms of risk. So you would be arguing for non-insane automatism if your automatistic state was a one-off. In other words, the loss of control is not something that regularly happens to you. It was just something that happened in that moment. So if you had a stroke, or you were hit by a baseball bat, or you were given a mix of pharmacological agents that made you sleepwalk, these things could fall into the non-insane automatism category. In other words, the defense is you weren't in control of your body, but that lack of control is not a recurring feature of you. So from the court's perspective, you are not at risk to continue or repeat the automatistic actions that you committed. So the court is free to say, not guilty. In other words, your body committed a crime, but it's been established beyond a reasonable doubt that it wasn't you in charge, some sort of organic change that led to you not being in charge of your body. Therefore, A, you're not responsible, and B, the court doesn't see you as a recurring risk because it was a one-off, non-insane automatism. The court can simply say, not guilty, and let you back out into the world. Contrast that with insane automatism. Once again, from the court's perspective, insanity is a measure of risk. If you're arguing for insane automatism, the argument goes you weren't in charge of your body, but it's a recurring problem, usually a psychiatric one. So maybe you have dissociative disorders, maybe you have somnambulism, i.e. sleepwalking. If it's established that beyond a reasonable doubt you weren't in charge of your body, and in this case you weren't in charge of your body as a function of a regular problem, a regular insanity that you have, then the court will find you not guilty, but since the automatism is tied to a recurring state, the court may need to do a bit more due diligence in terms of making sure that society is protected from you, so you will be found not criminally responsible on account of a mental disorder, or NCRMD, but this status means that the court could potentially detain you for up to 10 years if you continue to present a risk to others. But the general point here was just that Canada has enshrined in various ways in the legal system the idea of the normal person. So anything that the law cares about, maybe negligence, is going to have a bell curve behind it. So there's a normal amount of care that people would take, and if you are very low, in terms of the norm on caretaking, we would call that negligence. But of course the law mostly just cares about the state of your mind at the time of the alleged offense. Something we'll get into a little bit more later in the course. Your introduction to the normal curve in psychology was likely the intelligence bell curve. And while it's not productive pedagogically to dilate on intelligence, because students tend to put in less work when you mention intelligence, because those who see themselves as low don't want to try anymore, and those who see themselves as high feel they shouldn't have to try. So priming the idea of intelligence is generally not productive in lectures. I just want to make two quick points about the tails, the abnormal bits of the intelligence bell curve. On the high end, you have the individuals who are abnormally good at abstract problem solving. It is useful to identify these individuals so we can get them into NASA and they can work on saving us from the future asteroid that could potentially destroy us. Or, put a bit more negatively, we need to make sure the school system doesn't waste or destroy these potential geniuses. On the other side, we have abnormally low intelligence. In legal contexts, this comes up because some people don't understand things, like the charter caution that officers are required to read you when you're arrested. And there's a larger problem, epistemic injustice. Holding people accountable to laws that they don't understand might be unjust. Now, IQ scores are useful because they can give us an objective measure of intelligence that might prevent us from introducing more bias in the form of subjective assessments of individuals' intelligence. But the specific example I want to give you is McNamara's folly. When the US couldn't draft enough troops to fight in Vietnam, Robert McNamara realized they had a problem. So to get more bodies, he looked for individuals who might be a little more desperate to join the military. Military standards were to reject applications and to not draft individuals who were, quote, low aptitude, and also those with violent convictions. McNamara decided to change the rules and take what were called Category 4 applicants. These were individuals with an IQ, according to the Armed Forces Intelligence Quotient Test, of less than 92. So in the early 1960s, the Armed Forces allowed these individuals with an IQ of below 92 to enlist and, in most cases, go overseas to Vietnam to fight. Now, these individuals tended to be noticeably different from their peers. They were described as slow and labeled by their peers in the military as McNamara's morons. There was also a fifth category of recruits called Category 5 with an IQ below 72. Some individuals from this category were taken as well. This has been described as a crime against the mentally disabled. That's a quote from Robinson. And one question might be, why? The Category 5 individuals came willingly. Why is it our job to tell them that they can't be in the military? Well, we could list a whole bunch of paternalistic justifications about how it's our job to take care of the less fortunate, or we could just cite statistics or results. Namely, these low IQ volunteers were more than twice as likely to die in combat, to get lost in the jungle, and to put their own comrades at risk through not knowing how to use their equipment, not knowing how to navigate, and in some cases not being able to follow simple directions. One story from the book McNamara's Folly involved a low IQ recruit whose job was just to ask for the password when somebody new approached. A member of this individual's own troop came and gave the correct password, but the low IQ troop shot him anyway, and the reason he gave was he couldn't remember what the password was. The point is just that ignoring this type of abnormality abnormality led to death and injustice. There are many people who do not like the IQ tool as a concept in general, in part because it's been misused, but this is a case where not using that tool is what caused the harm. A neat little side fact here is that McNamara's lowering of the IQ cutoff led to the opposite of what we typically associate with the Vietnam War, which is draft dodgers coming from the US to Canada. This of course occurred, but there were also some individuals who went from Canada because Canada would not accept them into the armed forces to the States and then signed up in the US where they met standards, or met the lack of standards, and went overseas to fight as volunteers. Another place we encounter normal. Child development. Is my child progressing normally? Are they meeting the right cutoffs? Are they breathing normally? Is their heart rate the acceptable heart rate? Blood pressure the acceptable blood pressure? Here we have World Health Organization charts for size, length, and weight. The upper curvy lines being length, and the lines actually describe moments on a bell curve. The central line being the 50th percentile or average, and moving out symmetrically from there. So let's take the weight of my son as an example. He's a 10-month-old Canadian male, and we last weighed him at 21 pounds, which is right about here, and you can see that is just above the 50th percentile, meaning my son is heavier than more than half of 10-month-old Canadian boys. Note that we only tend to get worried when we see something abnormal. Maybe the child is abnormally large for some reason, maybe the child is abnormally small for some reason. For the most part, we're worried about small, because maybe they're not eating well, not getting enough nutrition, but the bell curves tell us, based on the millions of Canadian babies that we've observed, what an abnormal, and therefore potentially attention-worthy, weight would be. Next, the way we learn to describe clinical cases can be generally useful in your everyday life, even to describe yourself. First, let's consider a case, and whenever we're considering a clinical or pathological case, what we're seeing is an adaptation problem. Here's Chuck, a 45-year-old family man recovering from alcoholism. Since he was a kid, he'd justify heavy drinking with the argument that his father died young, so he probably will too, and he might as well enjoy life. This is a fairly common rationalization, and when I ask students in lecture, most students know somebody who uses some sort of flavor of this rationalization for their behavior. Chuck was diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver when he was 40, meaning his liver is slowly dying and being replaced by scar tissue, leading to intense swelling of his stomach. Despite this, it took Chuck 2 full years to quit drinking. In the process, he took up heavy smoking. It's called stimulus substitution. It's quite common. With a cirrhotic functioning liver, Chuck is at heightened risk from the smoking. Even in light of the suffering that resulted from alcoholism, when he's confronted about smoking, he uses his old rationalization that his father died young, so he probably will too, and he might as well enjoy life. In a clinical context, our question is, what's the problem? And there are going to be several things that determine what the problem that we find is. One will be what the client needs or wants from us, and the second will be the perspective that we take on the issue. And our perspective is usually funneled through one of the psychological theories that we like. So what is the problem? Some things we can consider. First, what is it that's not working? What appears dysfunctional? And what risk does this dysfunction bring with it? Next, where is the distress in this situation? Chuck is here because somebody is distressed by Chuck's behavior, and it doesn't appear to be Chuck if we take his rationalizations at face value. So who or what is being harmed and to what degree? Next, what are we working with in terms of values? What norms are being broken or violated? And why is this not enough for the client to cease their behavior? Now those are all very vague, so let's funnel things into some terms. Some things that we could identify if we were reading a case study. The big one, the adaptational problem, is termed the presenting problem. Why is the client at the clinic? With Chuck, the problem is the smoking behavior, and it's a problem because of his high risk for harm. He doesn't have the liver to metabolize the cigarettes, so the smoking behavior is the problem. But already my own slant towards behaviorism and the observable is showing, because you could also say that the problem is his attitude or his beliefs or his denial. But sticking with the observable, the problem is the smoking. Chuck's rationalizations and things like the frequency of his smoking behavior would fall under a clinical description. With Chuck, it would be important to note that he is downplaying the importance of the consequences. He's implying that the negative health effects of smoking are irrelevant because he's going to die anyway. Now, what we'll also note, now that we have the presenting problem, is how prevalent is the problem? How often is this problem come across? Usually prevalence is yearly prevalence, so the amount of Canadians, for example, who are addicted to smoking cigarettes, the term for which is tobacco use disorder, is somewhere around 10 or 12%, meaning in a given year, you can expect roughly 12% of the Canadian population to be experiencing addiction to cigarettes. That's what prevalence gives you. The DSM-5 gives statistics that are highly skewed toward the US, but their prevalence is probably close enough, so we'd say, oh, it's about 14% of individuals have this problem in a given year. Incidence refers to the number of new cases in a time period, usually in a year, that we can expect to see. This is important for tracking change, but incidence numbers can sometimes mislead people who mistake incidence statistics for prevalence statistics. If I tell you that the incidence rates for COVID are going down, that still means we're getting new cases of COVID. Prevalence can be going up while incidence is going down, especially if you have a lot of people that survive. Let's say in year 1 I have 1 case. So my prevalence and my incidence are both 1. Let's say that person survives, and the next year I again have an incidence of 1. There's one new case. My prevalence is now 2 because I have the original person who had it, and now I have the new person who has it, but my incidence is still just 1. In the case of tobacco use disorder, incidence appears to be going down because fewer people are taking up smoking, and prevalence rates are creeping down slowly as well. But of course, incidence seems a little bit abstract or removed from the case at hand, but it's helping to contextualize the case. One thing a client will want is they'll want you to explain what they can expect in terms of how their disorder might unfold with treatment and without treatment. We could likely roughly say that without assistance, tobacco use disorder would be a chronic problem, and with assistance, it would be an episodic problem. In other words, you probably will not quit successfully on your first try, but with help you could likely remain abstinent for a time. Time limited would likely not be relevant here as a potential course for Chuck. Tobacco use disorder is not likely to fix itself on its own. So we have the fact that Chuck got off of alcohol previously, and the fact that he is in our office. So we might say that we expect an episodic course for Chuck's tobacco use disorder. We'd put it around 5% likely that Chuck would be successful on his first attempt at quitting cigarettes. Of those who persist in continuing to quit, we tend to expect, as a general baseline, around half of them will quit for good if they continue to make attempts to quit smoking. Next is what the client will definitely ask you for, which is a prognosis. What do you think, Doc? What's going to happen? What are my chances? What does my future look like according to your expertise? And maybe I'm just optimistic, but I'd say the chances of Chuck successfully quitting smoking are fair. It won't be easy, but he's proven he can do addictions therapy successfully. And he's in a relatively low-risk category because he has a family that cares about him and no other comorbid disorders or addictions. We'll try and we'll make sure that whatever stimulus substitution happens this time is good for him. Get him something with which to replace smoking. In Chuck's file, you'll also see or need to write the origin story of Chuck's problem, the etiology. So Chuck's addiction problems started out with drinking and then led to smoking. Our theoretical perspective is going to determine how we write up Chuck's etiology. Smoking replaced drinking, but what exactly did it replace? Is it his simple biological need to be stimulated by a substance? In which case, well, the effects of smoking and the effects of drinking are quite different. Is it something deeper? A psychological need to satisfy a dark shadow self longing? Or maybe his addiction is part of a social performance such that he doesn't feel like himself if he's not doing something harmful to himself, or something that conforms to a party or self-satisfaction social persona. So we have some tools. We have some tools of clinical description. 7 of them. Let's apply them. Let's say we're reading Dave's file, and from Dave's file we have some snippets. I'm going to take each snippet and then ask you what term or what aspect of the clinical description this snippet represents. He's a client with dissociative symptoms. In other words, sometimes he doesn't feel like himself or recognize himself. Let's see if we can properly label the aspects of his file. First, Dave feels detached from himself, and as if those around him are only pretending to be themselves. What is this snippet describing? If you're not sure, go back to the earlier bits and then see if you can figure it out before answering. Spoiler coming, here comes the answer. It's the presenting problem. This is why Dave is there. This is why Dave is one of your clients. Next snippet. Dissociation in children may generate problems with memory, concentration, attachment, and traumatic play. Which aspect of a clinical description is this? Presenting problem, prevalence, incidence, prognosis, course, or etiology? Spoiler coming. It's the course, because it's talking generally about what we expect when we see this disorder. To those of you who guessed prognosis, it could be the prognosis if we were saying that this is specifically what we think Dave is going to experience. But usually the prognosis is given away by the fact that it has subjective and positive and negative valence types of words like fair, good, poor within it. So this is describing the general course of the disorder. It's not a specific prediction for Dave. Next snippet. About 1.6% of U.S. males and 1.4% of U.S. females have dissociative identity disorder. This is from the DSM-5. If we saw it in Dave's chart, what would this be? It is B. This is how many people we can expect to have the disorder in a given year. It's the prevalence. Next snippet. Recovery is anticipated to be difficult, but not improbable due to salient reminders of the abuse. Which clinical description concept are we dealing with here? This one should be more identifiable as the prognosis. What's going to happen, Doc? Give it to me straight. Well, it's going to be difficult. And here's why. 2 more. After attending a religious function, the client began to believe he was possessed by a spirit, the first alternate personality. Which clinical description concept is this snippet? The tense kind of gives it away. Began. It's the origin story, the etiology. Finally, we have one more, which you could figure out by process of elimination. The clinic has seen 6 new cases of dissociative identity disorder this year. What are we talking about here? New cases. New cases means incidents. So there's your 7 concepts, the first being clinical description in general, the other 6 being options A through F. Now the opener to this section said that clinical descriptions can be generally useful. So what you can do is a thought experiment. You can consider something about yourself that you might like to change. It can be a habit, a trait, an emotion, a reaction to things, an interest, a focus, an obsession. Some examples of what students tend to land on with this thought experiment: unhealthy habits, like skipping breakfast; unnecessary and unhelpful attitudes, like anger, worry, or those that deflect responsibility away from yourself; skills, especially emotional intelligence types of skills, like sitting down to learn something that's actually difficult; or self-management skills, which usually just start with proper self-monitoring. When we surveyed Canadian university students regarding how much time they spent on their phones, when we actually measured usage, the average was between 4 and 5 hours. When we just asked individuals, the numbers they reported were about an hour. In other words, people were underestimating, students like you, were underestimating the time that they spend on their phone per day by a factor of 4. So once you have the specific thing that you would like to change in mind, maybe it's diet, maybe it's exercise, maybe it's procrastinating learning statistics, time on social media, actually looking at your budget to see what you actually spend, rather than just convincing yourself that next week you'll spend less. Maybe it's calling your mother or father, which could represent an olive branch or a letting go of a certain emotion you shouldn't have anymore, because it's not helpful to you. Whatever you land on as something that you would like to change about yourself, you take that thing and then you use your clinical description concepts. First, what is the thing that I want to change? What is the presenting problem? Now, you may have a goal, but that's not necessarily your problem. It's not the thing that's being fixed, nor is it the thing that's in the way of the goal, making it difficult to get to the goal. What is the problem? Why are you there as your own client, seeking help from yourself? Next, normalize things a little bit. How common do you think this issue is? Specifying it and specifying prevalence will probably help to give you a sense of what help will be available and how normal you are for having this challenge. Next, give yourself a prognosis. Guess what? This doesn't have to be a rosy and optimistic go get a motivation session. It can be realistic. Around 5% of people who try to quit smoking succeed on the first try. That might make you feel like not trying to quit, but it should also make you feel pretty good if you try to quit and you fail on the first try. Guess what? You're normal. Keep trying. At this point, you can probably get an idea of what the course of your journey is going to be like. This will help you plan for that. It's the very beginning of a nice, fine-grained understanding of what it will take to succeed in changing yourself, your reaction, or a given behavior. It's at this point that the origin story becomes potentially important, because if something drove you to the feelings or the behaviors that you want to change, or the habits that you want to change, then that thing or event or something like it may drive you back there, and that might be what you need to protect yourself against if you want to change the habit or aspect successfully. So this is what a clinical description offers, and it does. You specify an issue, you put it in context, and that gives you the material you need to prognosticate, predict what's coming, and plan for it. It starts with specifying the presenting problem and builds out from there. So let's take a brief look at demonic and early biological models. So the demonic model explained abnormal behavior, things that we would probably now consider to be the product of psychopathology, or perhaps something like encephalopathy or viral infection, were likely back in the day to have been explained by evil spirits. How do you get these psychological abnormalities out? You engage in exorcisms, you attempt to destroy the individuals who invite the demons in. Usually in both Christian and Islamic interpretation, there's a tendency to see the demons as invited by the witches or wizards, or people who were possessed by these demons. In the Quran, in Surah 2, Verse 102 is the statement that the spirits can't take you over without your consent. In fact, they even ask, are you sure that you want to do this? And in the Bible, there's the idea of having familiarity with spirits. The point being that someone who happens to have a demon inside of them is still to blame for having somehow invited that demon in. There's lots of scholarship on why the witch hunts, most famously the Salem witch hunts, happened, especially in Europe and North America. You see lots of explanations depending on the perspectives of the person giving the explanations. There were instructions written down 1,000-odd years beforehand to do things like kill witches. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. A man or a woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. In a world where most of the populace can't read, and the general model of truth is a trust in authority, and the authority trusts in a book that says this, it's not too difficult to imagine that things like witch hunts are going to happen. In fact, they're still happening. Search around on Google for a little while and look at people being put to death or accused of being witches across the world. Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Ghana, literal witch hunts are still happening. The point is not that witches and the demonic model of mental illness are the same thing, but they happened to have their origins in roughly the same place, which is the belief in some sort of evil, personified and acting in the world in a negative way. more than half of North Americans still believe in a cartoonish type of character called Satan running around influencing the world. Now, the majority could happen to be right about this. My concern is just that it might make them wrong about interpreting mental illness. So the United States has a very high belief in the devil. These are pretty old numbers, but back in 2004, the US was tracking at about 70% of individuals saying they believe in the devil. More recently, they were asked about exorcism specifically, and 51% of sampled U.S. citizens said they believe that someone can be possessed by the devil or another evil spirit. So there's a belief that possession could happen, though most respondents say they believe it happens rarely. Does it translate to a belief in the power of exorcism? In other words, does this belief in a spiritual manifestation of evil in the world bring a risk that people who engage in strange behaviors might be interpreted as needing a priest rather than a shrink? Or pills? Yes. 46% of people polled in the USA said they believed in the power of exorcism. We may treat the demonological model as some strange blip or curiosity of history, but frankly, it's still here. And depending on where you go in the world, belief in things like witchcraft and demonic possession can be held by 80 or 90% of the population of the country. So the same belief in the devil question that we asked people in the United States back in 2004, we asked the people in Canada as well. Recall that the US had 70% of people believing that the devil exists. In Canada, we're at about 37%. So if the numbers stay proportional, I might guess that around 20% of Canadians believe that exorcism is an effective intervention. The point is not to mock or marginalize these different ways of knowing. The point is to warn you, as future social workers, nurses, therapists, counselors, human resource managers, middle managers, and leaders of other humans, that you will likely encounter this supposedly historical conception of mental illness in the 2020s. In fact, there's some recent scholarship that might suggest that the events of COVID-19 might increase a belief in a literal devil. This was published in 2019. In contexts defined by higher historical pathogen prevalence, people were more likely to believe in the devil, the malevolent power of the evil eye, and in witches who channel evil. Across all three studies, we uncovered consistent evidence that historical pathogen prevalence is related to an increased tendency to believe that there are forces of evil at work in the world. For your exorcism consultation visit, contact the Archdiocese of Toronto. They'll hook you up. So during the Renaissance, during the rebirth, we rediscovered the idea of Aristotle that you could look down at the ground and find stuff out for yourself rather than looking up to the sky or to authority for the answers. So we tried some things. We tried some medical interventions for mental illness. They didn't work. They were terrible. But we at least had the beginnings of an empirical approach, something that we could learn from. So let's make a case for bloodletting, because obviously it was not a very effective method for most of the things that we were trying to treat with it. It stuck around as modal practice until, barely over 100 years ago. So let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of bloodletters. You're a physician. Your job is to heal the sick. You've been taught that you need to balance the humors, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. You're in an asylum, and the behavior that you are asked to correct is the acting out of the asylum patients. Maybe you play with a few different substances to manage the biles, then maybe you decide to manage the blood by bleeding some of it out. Maybe this will help the balance. So you bleed some of your patients, and what do you notice? Well, their acting out decreases. They calm down. Just like you, when you have low blood sugar or low blood pressure, you kind of want to have a little nap. Moreover, the more you bleed them, the calmer your patients get. This is a dose-response relationship. Of course we're going to think it works. The problem is you're just treating the symptoms, so eventually they come back to their acting out state. Something else that we were doing at this time was trying to shock people back into their right mind. Now this involved all kinds of horrors. There was a spinning chair that you would get strapped to and spun around in for hours. There was the death-simulating coffin that you would lie in and then have it be filled with water to quote-unquote simulate your drowning. And then there was a good old snake pit that we dangle you in front of, which is how asylums got the derogatory term of snake pit. But let's try to make a case for terror. Imagine once again you're a physician and your job is to heal the sick, and it appears to be some sort of disease of the mind. They're physically healthy, yet they're acting erratically or irrationally. Maybe you think you can just scare them into their right mind. Now this is where I could point out that a lot of this was probably a holdover or a copy over from the demonological model, because one of the ideas there, like exorcism, is to make the body unlivable for the demon. You can imagine two types of physicians. One who maybe believes in the demonological model, and he says, well, we need to make the host body unlivable so that the demon flies out. Or maybe the physician that doesn't believe in the demonological model, but believes that there's nothing physically wrong with the patient, so they need to be snapped into their right mind, maybe tortured into their right mind, because since there's nothing wrong with their body, we just need to persuade them to get better. So let's say then you start systematically terrifying all of your patients with your new fancy simulated drowning tool. What do you notice? You notice that your patients appear different afterwards. Now, maybe they're just in shock, right? Because what's shock? You prioritize to the trunk and head your blood flow, and so you have pallor of the limbs and you're shaking and you might not be able to walk very well, but your core is being taken care of with blood flow. So maybe they're in immediate shock, and maybe that shock extends, and maybe it also turns into submission, because this is what tends to happen when you're tortured by someone. You get broken, and that might look like progress from the standpoint of an asylum director. My point here is only that these individuals back in the past did have evidence for what they were doing. It wasn't great evidence, but they did have evidence. The trouble was, without systematic standards of a scientific method, i.e. a way to distinguish between good evidence and just meh evidence, you tend to end up perpetuating rather unproductive treatments and perspectives. So when they were using things like bloodletting to treat mental illness in the asylums, it's not that they didn't have evidence, they just didn't have good standards for evidence. Over the course of a couple hundred years, the biggest improvement was just the idea of treating individuals like humans. Moral treatment said, don't chain up patients, try to treat them as though they have value and dignity. For the most part, we weren't doing anything for these individuals in terms of physical treatment, but we were improving by virtue of torturing them less. Most intro textbooks put the dawn of the modern era of biological treatment at the birth of chlorinated promazine. When we discovered that a drug could reduce psychosis, the world changed and asylums changed. It no longer became just about housing the individuals that society had no other way to deal with. There was actually a feasible path to release or reintegration of these most serious cases of mental illness. In the 50s and 60s, individuals who were thought to be beyond hope were put on Thorazine, and then they were able to take back up their hobbies and go home for the first time in decades. There were women calling up to hospitals saying, "My husband is here, why did you let him free?" And they said, "Well, he's fine now. We gave him medicine that fixed him." To which some replied, "No, just take him back, I don't want him." This wasn't the deal with institutionalization. Well, the deal changed. With Thorazine and other drugs, we could institute a big change, which we called deinstitutionalization. It consists of two parts. One, you medicate the individuals until you see a reduction in symptoms, and then send them into the streets. Two, shut the doors behind them, and maybe even demolish the building entirely. Problem solved. We fixed mental illness with deinstitutionalization. Many of the positions my students end up working in today are positions that have arisen because we had to fill in the gaps in treatment. Not all deinstitutionalized individuals went home and were fine. Some had no homes to go to. Some were only able to stay or make new homes temporarily. Many people who were institutionalized needed much more help than just a handful of meds, and so we have extended community care systems in place today. The results of deinstitutionalization were mixed. I'm partial to allowing individuals their freedom, so I'm happy when I read cases about people who went back to lead normal lives. But it's impossible to walk through downtown Toronto without thinking we could be doing more for those with mental health issues. Whether this translates to more live-in care, I don't know. But many individuals who spent time in asylums greatly appreciated the reprieve from normal life, something that the avuncular Oliver Sacks wrote in an essay I think entitled Reconsidering the Asylum. We are still today solving the problem of deinstitutionalization. Sometimes the word used is integration, but one of the fundamental debates in Canada and elsewhere is still over the types and extent of support we should be giving individuals with mental health challenges. Our approach to figuring out how to help people today emphasizes evidence and prediction, not a reliance on authority, not a reliance on simple observation or evidence without standards, and also not just convincing stories, which is what Freud had to offer us, and still offers us today. Concluding Lecture 1, it's normal to have some abnormalities. The question is whether the traits that we're abnormal in happen, by luck of the draw, to be things important to getting around in the world we've created. Hopefully I've shown you that a clinical description can be generally useful. Its goals are likely goals you have elsewhere as well, to get a clear picture of what's in front of you, how to confront it, and put it in context. And finally, we've seen that old theories of mental illness are still around, but in the next few lectures, we'll see that we can do better than these old theories, starting with the new standard of multidimensional biopsychosocial approaches. Stay tuned for more.